Hey there, my name is Shane Craddock, and this is the Inner Edge podcast, where I share a different take on how to lead and live a sustainable, high-performance life. Over the course of different episodes, I'm going to challenge the belief that tension, stress, and struggle are essential to success and creativity. My experience is that there's an easier way, there's a better way, and indeed there's an essential way that we need to explore for the times that we live in. So let's go ahead, let's jump in and explore. Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of The Inner Edge with me, Shane Craddock. You're very welcome. Today we're talking about slumps, getting out of them. I was speaking at an event recently for a company where there was a lot of salespeople, and it was one of these kind of annual kickoff events. And we were talking about, I was just sharing some stories to do with mindset and state of mind, state of being, and the impact that that can have on not just your business performance, but also your life. And the subject was around winning at the game of life. Now, afterwards, somebody just very briefly asked me a question about how do you get out of a slump when you're in a sales context? And that was at the back of my mind. I had a quick chat with them about it, gave a little bit of information. It was obviously at the back of my mind. And then I was listening to a podcast myself a few days ago called The Rest is Football. I'm a fan of the English Premier League and soccer scene, and that podcast is hosted by Gary Lineker with Alan Shearer and Micah Richards. And Gary Lineker is a very famous English footballer, soccer player, and they just brought up coincidentally about how to get out of a slump, and they were just chatting about that. From what would be the advice you give to somebody who's gone into a slump? And Alan Shearer, his advice was like, look, just keep at it. It's a cycle. It happens to everybody. You just got to keep showing up, keep putting yourself in positions to score goals, especially as a striker. And that was his advice, which is good advice. And then Gary Lineker interestingly said, well, he was a little bit superstitious. And he said that if he went into a slump, he'd get a haircut. Because in his mind, it was his way of getting a fresh start. Now, both have different advice, bits of advice. And at the same time as Gary Lineker was saying that, he also said afterwards, look, I know it's poppycock, I think was the word he used, as in it's not real, but still he did it. Now, what I'm always curious about coming at it from a performance point of view, and in particular from the inner edge point of view, is that for me, getting out of a slump is nothing to do with superstition. And it's all to do with distracting or unlocking yourself from unhelpful thinking. And that's what I want to explore a little bit about today. Now, it's my experience that everybody at different times will find themselves in a slump, regardless of whether it's soccer or some version of a sport, although it can be quite common in sport, but also just in your work as a leader. Even just as a human being, you can find you're like, oh, I'm down on myself. Maybe I know I'm not as clear as I'd like. I'm not as productive or as effective as I'd like. I think that's a universal thing. Now, obviously I've talked about Gary Lineker and Alan Shearer. They were talking about scoring goals, where you kind of go in a slump of scoring goals. It's quite a common thing. And then they say when you find your scoring boots, then the goals just keep coming, especially if you're a good striker. And that is true. But for me, I think there's a dynamic underneath that I want to point to today that I think is really the key thing about understanding what's happening mentally or in your inner world. Now, with Alan Shearer, his advice was you have to keep turning up, keep putting in a shift, putting yourself in positions where you can score goals, knowing that eventually it will turn. And to me, that's a sign of resilience, but also that's a clever use of thinking. It's a very clever use of thinking. His self-talk there is very much, no, I'm not accepting that this is the way it's going to be. I'm too good, but this just happens. So that's a kind of a very good logical way to talk to yourself. That's using thought. That's a good way to almost get out of unhelpful thinking. So that definitely helps. If you're talking to a salesperson like I was at that speaking event, it was interesting that when I was talking to them, they were saying, well, look, I can go into a slump for about 3 months, but then I come out of it. So when it comes in, it kind of lasts for 3 months, which I find fascinating because I just don't think slumps, unless we let them be a definite amount of time, I just don't think they have to be a definite amount of time. I think you can kind of go into a slump and come out of it reasonably quickly once you understand what's keeping you in the slump. And again, the definition for me of a slump is a drop in your effectiveness in whatever you do, in any context. So you got to think about what's actually causing the problem. Like, what brings somebody into a slump? For me, and if you've been listening to these podcasts, this shouldn't surprise you. For me, the answer is bad thinking, or thinking that's unhelpful and it's getting in the way of your best. It's thinking, because your thinking directly relates to what you're feeling, and that impacts on everything: your behavior, your actions, your attitude. Now, with Gary Lineker and his haircut, which is quite a funny one, but he found that it helped. What I think that's pointed to is that it was his way of trying to break the pattern of thinking that comes with a slump, as in, doubting yourself, maybe feeling insecure, maybe feeling inferior, maybe afraid you're going to lose your job or your position, or that this mood is going to stay. So I think in that context, anything that helps you distract yourself from the thinking that's unhelpful is a good thing. Anything. Once it doesn't have negative consequences. So for example, I could distract myself by drinking a lot. That's going to have negative consequences. So I'm not talking about something like that. I'm talking about a healthy distraction. That could be simple as going on a holiday. It could be what Alan Shearer's advice was: just keep showing up. And I know by keep showing up that's very persistent. That's what I'm telling myself. It could be finding some way it could be just meditation. It could be anything that works for you. A walk, a break, meditation, exercise. I think it's not the technique that matters is the key thing. It's whatever allows you to release that unhelpful thinking, to get unlocked from it, to release its hold on you. Now, for most people, I think it's universally true to say that when a slump comes in, it brings in the enemy of high performance, which is tension. And tension comes from us reacting perhaps to what we think might be a slump. What's reaction? Well, it's thinking about, oh no, here we go. I hope it's not a slump. I hope it doesn't last for 3 months, whatever that person said. Or I hope it doesn't stop me scoring goals. I hope it doesn't stop me hitting my target. Oh no, not now. It brings in tension. Now, the tension comes from us reacting to that feeling. And in a weird way, once you understand some of the dynamics here, for me, what seems to make weird contrarian sense is that if you can find a way to make friends with the slump or the feeling of the slump, that it's less likely to stick around. If you don't react to the feeling that comes with, oh no, here comes a low mood, if you can make friends with it, if you can kind of almost say, okay, you're here, I'm just not going to react to it. Because I think the real trick to coming out of a slump, no matter what you do, no matter who you are, is to be okay with the feeling of being in a slump. And if you can recognize it for what it is, which is at some level, your thinking is taking control. Some level, usually at the back of your mind. And the reason for that is because, your experience of life is just your thoughts in action. It's not reality. So you might think, oh, no, I'm in this slump now for the next couple of months. That's just the way it is. Says who? That's your thoughts in action. And you might say, well, it's happened every year for the last 10 years, Shane. And I'm still going to say, well, that's just your thoughts in action. Your experience is your thoughts in action. And the best technique to come out of something like a slump comes from clear understanding of how our mind works and how our inner world works. Because then it's easier to kind of dismiss the unhelpful thinking that always comes with a slump. So here's a question for you. What do you say to yourself when you go into a slump? Everybody does. So what's your approach? Do you have any superstitious approaches like Gary Lineker? Do you have specific strong self-talk like Alan Shearer? Or do you have something else? I'm always amazed at how creative people can be with something like this. You might never have thought about it. You think, well, that's just the way it is. Or maybe, look, I'll go into the slump and it'll go away after 4 weeks. And maybe that works for you. But what I'm wondering today is, could you consider that your thinking is having a massive impact on not just bringing in the slump, but actually holding it around? And actually, if you can disrupt that pattern of thinking that's there in the background, you will find you can almost come out of the slump in an instant. Like literally 1 second, there, heavy, the next second, gone. There was a quote when I was thinking about this podcast that I came across, and I'll throw it in. It kind of relates a little bit to the Alan Shearer approach, but I like it in general from a kind of a persistence thing. And it's by a guy called Charles F. Kettering. It's keep on going, and the chances are that you will stumble on something, perhaps when you are least expecting it. I've never heard of anyone ever stumbling on something sitting down. So I think that's an interesting one too, because it kind of points to don't let a slump or, whatever word you want to use, don't let it stop you. We got to keep moving in a way, almost whether that's cutting your hair like Gary Lineker, or just keep going like Alan Shearer, putting yourself in positions where eventually you will score goals. There's a lot to be said for that. Having said that, if you want to reduce the down feeling, the tension feeling that comes with a slump, just consider the level of impact that your thinking is having on how you feel. Because I suppose slumps happen. They seem to happen to everybody from what I can see, including me. But you can come out of them quicker when you distract yourself from the unhelpful thinking that comes with them, that can hold them there. And just remember again, your experience is just your thoughts in action. It's not reality. It's the reality often that we tell ourselves. That's it for this week. Ciao for now.